I was looking at the mirror. I just wanted to feel like spitting at myself, spit on my skin or something. I just hated it, disliked it. I just felt like people look at me and call me the N word, you know. That's why I hated myself. Even if I was a little bit lighter than this, you see, gesturing vertical hierarchy. There's black, and then there's light, and then there is a little bit black, and then there is mulatto, and then all the way down here is where tar is, and I'm like there, pointing to the bottom. That's what I feel like, These kinds of light skinned guys, they get away with everything. Me, I'm black. So I said somewhere regarding this young man isn't looking at himself through his own eyes. He's looking at himself through European eyes, through what people say. So what he sees when he looks at the mirror is not himself, it's what he's been told he is. That's what Eurocentrism does to people. Hello, everyone. Welcome to another lecture video. So this one is based on a presentation I did a while ago at a conference, Ronald E. Hall conference on colorism in the August of 2023. It was on colorism, youth marginality and empowerment from an Afrocentric perspective. So that's the title of the presentation. So these are the topics I'm going to cover. This is obviously a lecture, so it's not an in-person lecture, so there'll be no any icebreaker. But these are the topics I'm going to cover. Because this is about youth issues, I will have policy recommendations. So how to address colorism to help young people who are bombarded with Eurocentric ideals from Hollywood and lifestyle magazines. So the main objective of the presentation is to help young people center themselves in the present through history. So to use history to inform how they feel about themselves today. So I'll give you some examples, some historical examples about how Africans before colonialism used to center themselves in the context of appearance and skin color. So the first three parts, I'm going to go through them quickly. My encounter with colorism in Sudan and in Kenya and in Canada. So these are crucial, but I've already tackled them in a different context in the other video through blackness, but this is through colorism. They have overlapping topics. So let me start with Sudan. So in Sudan with the Turco-Egyptians, there were different groups of people who were along the Nile Valley in Egypt and Sudan. When Muhammad Ali began what is now modern Sudan, Muhammad Ali was the one who, I'll show you his picture now. So in the Nile Valley, we had Africans or so-called blacks, Arabs, Turks, and Europeans. And there was some sort of a hierarchy of these people. And I'm going to show you a pyramid on how they were hierarchized and who was on the top, who was at the bottom. And you can guess by looking at this, given what we know now. So in 1820, Muhammad Ali, that's a gentleman, he was Albanian, but he was ruling Egypt on behalf of the Ottoman Empire. So he conquered Sudan in the 1820s and established what we now know as the modern Sudan under Turco-Egyptian. So they had slavery in Sudan, and slavery is always premised on racial difference. Not historically. Historically, it was really based on who you conquered. It didn't really matter if they looked like you or they didn't look like you. If you conquered them, you enslaved them. But because it was enslaving dark-skinned peoples, then in Sudan, there was a racial dimension to it. There was an identitarian dimension to that. So, and that brings in the question of appearance. So the people who were enslaved were really darkened skin, and that means dark-skinned people were synonymized with inferiority. So they would look down. And then in 1884, the Turco-Egyptian state was overthrown by the Mahdists. The Mahdists were led by this gentleman who was somehow puritanical. He did not like the Islam that was being practiced by the Ottomans. He didn't think, he thought it was impure. So he wanted to establish a puritanical version of Islam based on the Quran without any cultural blemishes. So he defeated the Mahdists, and under the Turco-Egyptians, there were many Europeans who worked for the Turco-Egyptian government. And one of them was Charles Gordon. He was an officer under the Ottoman Empire. That's why many of us, when we were kids, we used to hear Gordon Pasha, because in Arabic they don't have P, they will say B. That's why we also say police and say police. We used to hear Gordon Pasha. Pasha is the title, was the title of Ottomans. So when he was killed by the Mahdists, he was working for the Turco-Egyptians, but he was a British guy. So because this guy was a British, the British wanted to take a revenge because they were embarrassed by the Mahdists. They killed one of the generals. So Kitchener defeated the Mahadis. Not him, he died shortly. It was another gentleman, Khalifa, who replaced him. He's the one who was defeated by Kitchener as to take revenge for the killing of Charles Gordon. So he defeated the Mahadis in 1898, and then they established the Anglo-Egyptian Condominium in 1899 until 1956, when Sudan became independent from both Egypt and Britain. So I think Sudan is the only country that was ruled jointly by two imperial powers, the Egyptians and the British. And then after the independence, when we have the post-colonial Sudanese state, which was ruled mostly by Sudanese ruling elites who wanted to homogenize Sudan through Islam and Arabism. So he's one of the ruling elites. Mahdi was a great-grandson of this Mahdi. He's one of the rulers. I think he was became prime minister at 27, one of the youngest leaders. And they were the people who wanted to Arabize Sudan and establish Islam as the religion of the state. So these people valued people based on their appearance. So this is how people were valued along the Nile Valley. So British on top, or Europeans mostly, Egyptians, and then Arabs, Arab Sudanese, and then African Sudanese. Even among African Sudanese, those who were Muslims were valued higher. They would be higher than other African Sudanese, like South Sudanese, who were Christians, or what anthropologists would call animists. So this is the hierarchy of the people. So people were valued. And you could see there was a correlation between this hierarchy and color gradation. So the higher you go, the lighter the skin becomes. The lower you go, the darker the skin becomes. So I've already talked about the White Flag League and this gentleman, Ali Abdul Latif. He wanted a multiracial Sudan, but that's not something the elite in Sudan wanted. They wanted Sudan that was informed by Arabism and Islam. People like Ismail al-Azhari, who is the first prime minister of Sudan in 1956, they wanted a Sudan that is informed by one religion, Islam, and one culture, Arabism. So what people like Ali Abdul Latif wanted is something they disdained. They didn't like it. And people like Mahdi, they were also part of the agenda of Sudanese homogenizing Sudan into Arabism and Islamism. So they didn't like Sudan that was inclusive. And that's why people like Joseph Oduor fought for Sudan that is inclusive. Yes, they were fighting for independence, but they were fighting for independence because the Sudanese ruling elite were not interested in an inclusive Sudan, a multiracial, multireligious Sudan. So that's why they were fighting. So Oduor is formerly the head of the first independence movement or liberation movement in Sudan, the political wing, not the Anyanya. The Sudan African Closed District National Union, formed in 1962 in Leopoldville, which is now Kinshasa, and then was changed in 1963 into SANU, Sudan African National Union. So there was another one that was formed before SANU that was led by Saturnino, Father Saturnino. Some people see Father Saturnino as the first leader of the movement, a liberation movement. You can contextualize it. That is true in most cases, but the most prominent movement was under Oduor. Joseph Lago wasn't the first leader of Anyanya, although he took over in 1969, but he became prominent because of the way he unified the military wing and the political wing. The political wing was always independent from the Anyanya. Anyanya was formed in 1963, but SANU, which was Sudan African Closed District National Union, 1962, and then SANU, 1963. So they were formed before the Anyanya was formed. What happened in Torit in 1955 was a mutiny. So between 1955 and 1962, there were remnants of the Torit mutiny. They reminded South Sudanese that the war of liberation was to happen. They also acted as a reminder of that. They attacked government forces, but they were not organized. They had no coherent leadership. They had no organized manifesto. They had no organized leadership that was broad-based. So some people tend to think Anyanya was formed in 1955. No. But the remnants of 1955 became part of Anyanya in 1963. So Lago was part of it, but he wasn't the leader of Anyanya. Emilio Tefeng was the overall commander of Anyanya. Lago was only the Eastern Area Commander. So, but he took over in 1969, 1970, and then combined the military wing, and then political wing. And then he signed the agreement in 1972, Addis Ababa Agreement. That's why he became prominent. So what he did in late 1960s and early 1970s is what John Garang would later do in 1983. Those of Accord and Gaitut and Abdallah Choual wanted the military wing and the political wing to be separate, like in the age of SANU and Nyanya, but John Garang didn't want that. So those of John Garang, those of Lago, those of Oduo, and those of Adel Al-Taif, they wanted an inclusive Sudan that is not premised on appearance or race. But these people, they didn't. They wanted an inclusive Sudan that is fueled by calorism. Now, that was in Sudan. Then in Kenya, when we were in Kenya, the Kenyans would call us Meusi Kama Makaa, as black as charcoal. So there was a colorist element to our relationship with Kenyans. So if they look at this South Sudanese and they look at the Kenyan, so they consider themselves brown, although no one would call them brown in North America because we all become black. Even Sudanese Arabs, they become black in North America. So they saw this someone who looks like this, South Sudanese, as the one who is quintessentially black, and they were brown. Of course, there are Kenyans who are also as dark as South Sudanese. But most of the Kenyan we interacted with were they look like this, so they consider themselves brown. But they mocked us in terms of our appearance, but it was superficial. It was superficial mockery. There was no naturalized understanding of colorism. They didn't think we are inferior naturally. They knew it was just superficial skin difference, because when we competed with them in class, you couldn't tell. You couldn't tell. Most of the time we beat them. Sometimes we were on the same level. So it wasn't naturalized like it is in the West. There are some statements like what Museveni did. I don't know why he said what he said, but I'll quote him shortly. So this is Museveni in 2021. He said, when you look at South Sudanese, they are not black. They're actually blue. So that's Museveni in 2021. Now, this is George Schoenfurth. He was an Austro-German traveler and botanist. He went to South Sudan in the late 1800s, so 19th century. So this is what he said in one of his books. So it's a 2-volume recollection of his travel. He traveled a lot in South Sudan. The book is online, so you can get it on PDF. The blue tinge, which has been attributed to the Negro skin, is entirely a matter of imagination. It may be confidently asserted to be solely the reflection of the sky. So what Museveni is saying here is what he's calling the imagination. Remember, he was talking in the 19th century at the heart of what we call scientific racism, when Europeans started to come up with authenticated ideas that Africans were inferior, Europeans were naturally superior, that people were not just different, but the difference is natural, that Europeans are always and will always be the lords of the world, and especially Africans. But Schoenfurth said, well, what we see as blue is just a reflection of the sky, which is also another imagination. But the point here is, this is our neighbor in South Sudan. This is someone who fought for the freedom of his own people, and he's a friend of South Sudan. Saying something like this in 2021, something colonial anthropologists and colonialists used to say, is revealing. I don't know why he was saying this, what was his point, but many of you know Museveni sometimes talks like a child with no filters. He speaks like he's a child, speaks because he doesn't respect South Sudanese, and South Sudanese leaders will not call him out. No one in South Sudan is going to call him out. No one did. So he can say anything he wants. So, but if he's someone who is responsible, an African leader, these are not things you can joke about because they have painful history. So 147 years apart, an African leader, the so-called Pan-Africanist, is saying this, something this guy was saying. And this guy says some of the most horrible things about South Sudan, about South Sudanese. I've quoted him in my dissertation. So this is why South Sudanese are called blue-black. And this is something magazines and model agencies, agencies that work with these girls and women do. They want to reflect them like this because it reflects them as too different from Europeans. But what they admire from these girls is not the humanity, it's not that they're people they would value. They are reflected as if they're almost fossils. It's like they're objects. So what is valued is what they look like, not what is inside them as human beings. And I'm not sure whether these girls see this, but that's what they prefer. So magazines, they would picture them like this and make them as dark as possible. That's what they admire. So this is what we call blue-black. How about in Canada? So in Canada, colorism, it was different. The dynamics was completely different because it was naturalized. It wasn't as superficial as in Sudan and in Kenya, where they would just make fun of our skin and their skin, that they think their skin is beautiful, ours is not. That wasn't the case. Here, it was a different dynamic. It was like the Europeans are naturally beautiful and Africans are not. It's not a question of preference. It's a question of nature. That's how they did it. The difference were almost fossilized. It's a fossilized difference that you cannot change anything about. So beauty becomes Europeanized. In some cases, Kenyans would know that there's some beautiful South Sudanese girls. So there was no some sort of a Kenya-centric beauty. There was none. They understood there were some South Sudanese girls for beauty. But here, the standard of beauty is European. So beauty itself becomes synonymous with being European. So Europeanization of beauty is something you see in Canada. Then we live in a Eurocentric world. So everything we do, everything we perceive, everything we do is taken from the perspective of Europeans. So in Canada, we have different cultures, but the rest have to see the world through European eyes. So on face value, politicians and scholars would say, oh, we are equal, we are this, but no. Beneath that, if you go to institutions, you will see people are valued based on their appearance. So this is what Eurocentric world look like. Europeans centered themselves and everyone else revolved around them. Everyone learns from the European. The intelligence, morality, beauty is copied by these people. And there's nothing Europeans can learn from them. I'm going to show you a different centricity, which is advanced by Afrocentrics. It is different. It doesn't center anyone. But this is how we live today. Everything about intelligence, everything about power, everything about beauty is supposed to be copied. So Europeans are the epitome, the paragon of whatever is good to be copied. So this is a Eurocentric world. So there's something about appellations. I don't use in my scholarship, in my research and my writings, black, white, brown, and this, because I think these are all terminologies from slavery and colonial regimes. They shouldn't be used to that. People don't come from colors, they come from cultures, they come from values and traditions. So what I use instead is continental and diaspora Africans. So those of us who are born in Africa or can trace our roots to specific countries, we are continental Africans. Those who were brought to the West, to the Americas, through the transatlantic slave trade, I call them diaspora Africans. So Jamaican or Barbadian or African Americans. Cade are continental diaspora Africans, diaspora Europeans. So instead of white, I use Cade. So continental are the ones who are still on the continent. Diaspora are the ones who are in the US, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, or other places. So I use African Canadian instead of Black Canadian. Or something like that. European Americans instead of white Americans, African Americans instead of black. But there's also an issue with blackness that I want to notice. I'm writing a paper now that addresses that. Is some African Americans don't want to be called African Americans because they say they are Americans, which is conflating. I think they misunderstand the American identity and then African American identity. They think it's one or the other, that you cannot become an American, an African American. You have to be just one American. And they think there's someone who is an American, but here that's not the case. They are all hyphenated. So for example, this Mayweather, well-known boxer said in 2017, I'm not African American, I'm American. So in the paper, I'm working on it in what I call horizontal and vertical identities. The relationship between African American and American is vertical. The relationship between European American and African American is horizontal. And I will explain that in the book. But when they say I'm not African American, it's a misunderstanding of identity. It's the same, he's not alone. Well-known figures like Morgan Freeman, who said, I don't subscribe to that title, African American. Black people had different titles all the way back to the N-word. And I do not know how these things get such a grip, but everyone uses African American. So these identities are not individual identities. These are social identities. They are group identities. So you cannot just choose to say, I don't subscribe to that. That's not how social identities work. But there's a historical issue. This is not a new conversation. So if you read my dissertation, this goes back to the beginning of the 19th century. So newspapers were also having the same. They actually used to call themselves Africans, not just African American, just Africans. They named the institutions after African this, African school of this, African institution of this. They had to change when African Colonization Society came in, and then there was the abolitionist movement, so they had to change the names because they were told if you're Africans, then go to Africa. So it's a conversation that is more than a century old, but it's a misunderstanding of identity. Morgan Freeman is saying it doesn't subscribe to African American, and he said black people. He played Nelson Mandela. Why? Is it because he's black? But when they call themselves black, why are they called black? They're not called black because their ancestors came from Australia or from Solomon Island. If they use the term African American, if they use the term black American, they've already conceded being African. because the blackness they are invoking is the African blackness. So you cannot say black people and then say I'm not African. That doesn't really work. And also the relationship is something that is recent history. So there's a documented connection between African Americans and continental. So what is colorism? So definition. So this is one definition from Walker. Is this a prejudice or preferential treatment of same race people based solely on their skin color? So that's one definition. The other one is allocation of privilege and disadvantage according to the lightness or darkness of one's skin. So you prefer people or allocate privileges. For example, jobs, better grades or inclusion in neighborhoods, or loans and things like that. Because the lighter you are, the well-placed you are, and you get more privileges. The darker you are, the worse it is for you. Preference for light skin, white skin on a global scale. It's not just in Canada or in the West. You may see a German or a French going to Africa, and the Africans themselves will treat that European better than their own people. For example, you may see an English person in Uganda, and they go to a restaurant or a bar or a hotel. The concierge would want to serve the European first as opposed to African, because it is something that has been globalized, that he preferred people with lighter skin. For example, if you look at Nyakim, many of you know, calls herself our Queen of Dark, and then you have Marilyn Monroe. You don't have to be told, because many people will just say, this is the epitome of beauty. She's beautiful. Her, may be beautiful in the context of modeling. South Sudanese will say she's beautiful because they're used to her beauty. Europeans will say, okay, no. One of the things they say, they just don't say this is a beauty according to our standard. That's not what they say. They say this is the beauty, naturally speaking. That means she cannot be beautiful. And if they consider beauty, that's to be condescending. So what they want us to say is not to say, this is beautiful according to Europeans, this is beautiful also according to Africans. No, they want us to say, this is beautiful by all standards. Asian standard, African standard, European standard, because our beauty is not a question of preference. It's not a question of perspective. It's a question of nature. That's how they say. So if they're looking at the model, they look at an actress, they look at the best looking woman, most people will not go for her. They'll go for her. Why? That's colorism. You can also call it racism, but I have a different perspective. Because sometimes racism has to have an element of superiority. You can say she's beautiful, not because there's something superior, because you may say there's some things where she's gifted. She may say she's smarter than her. But racism will say, no, she cannot be smarter than someone who's light in skin. So you can become colorist without being racist, although you can be racist too. So you can say she's more beautiful, she's not beautiful, but she's more intelligent, she's not intelligent. A racist will not say that. A racist will not concede anything for Africans. So Africans cannot be better when compared to European in anything. So, but where did these things come from? They began in the 15th century when people from the Iberian Peninsula, when we talk about the Iberian Peninsula, we're talking about Spain and Portugal. Portuguese were the first to abduct Africans on the coast of Guinea. And when they brought Africans, they valued them based on their skin color. So they look at the lighter skin color because they were closer to them, so they preferred them more beautiful. But the darker skin one, they didn't. But remember, slavery was based on conquest. So if you conquered people who even look like you, that's who you enslaved. The synonymization of slavery with Africans, something that came later. So, but then later on, when slavery became commonplace and others joined the Spanish and the Portuguese, like the English, the Belgian, the Dutch, the French. So when they joined, ideas became developed for Europeans to sort of elevate themselves above what they already had. So ideas developed by people like scholars like Immanuel Kant, Johann Blumenberg. They develop ideas that Europeans are the quintessential essence of beauty. So example, Blumenberg used a skull of a Georgian woman. He's the one who came up with the idea of Caucasian, because there's a Caucasus mountain. And around there, for example, the people from Georgia, he used a skull of a Georgian woman, a slave woman, who was enslaved by the Ottomans. I think she was taken to what is now, I'm not sure whether they had changed the name, but they had changed the name by then. It used to be called Constantinople, after Constantine. But it's now Istanbul. So she was enslaved by the Ottomans, and then that's where she died. Because they used to enslave Europeans. It was a question of conquest. So she looked at the skull, and the skull was proportional. She said, this is the epitome of beauty. So people living around the Caucasus Mountain were the epitome of beauty. So he considered Europeans as the most beautiful people. So if you read Blumenberg, you'll find all those things. Immanuel Kant also wrote about beauty. There's a book that talks a lot about beauty of Europeans. And then they used these ideas to enslave Africans. Remember, I said people who were enslaved were people who were conquered. But over time, Europeans started to replace slaves, whether they were indigenous, whether they were Arabs, whether they were Europeans, they replaced them with Africans over time. So by the beginning of the 19th century, slavery became synonymous with Africans because Europeans were brought as indentured servants and they work alongside African slaves that would be brought from Europe and they work for 7 years, but then it would be, because of masters were really not kind people, they would lengthen, some of them work for 20 years. But there was a backlash in Europe because they were writing letters back home that they were being mistreated. They were treated just like African slaves. I have a case I quote in the dissertation where 3 gentlemen ran away, 2 European, 1 African. And when they were caught, the one who was punished the most was the European one. He was punished to work for 1 year with his legs chained. Imagine. They were branded just like cows. Not just Africans, Europeans were branded so that these masters would know when they ran away. So Europeans were also oppressed, but they were not oppressed for life. That was the difference. But imagine 3 people running away. The African was punished less. That was in the 1780s, less than the other European. That would not be the case by the 19th century. It wasn't possible to punish European the same way the Africans were punished. African became the bottom of the bottom. So when slavery became synonymous with Africans, Africans became the lowest. So, and then color became synonymous with being a slave, not like in the past where you were enslaved because of conquest. Racial segregation after the end of slavery exacerbated this because during slavery there was some sort of a consciousness where I'm a slave, they are my masters. So even if they live together, you knew your place. After the end of slavery, things became, how would we know? Because they are now free, but we want to maintain that European superiority. So they had to enforce racial segregation by law. So this is what brought us the Jim Crow, the US, apartheid in South Africa, and also imperial colonialism. And then it wasn't just we are different, you are inferior. So people were socially inferiorized and then subjugated. So we're not just different, you are inferior. And because you're inferior, I'm going to subjugate you. I'm going to be your master. I'm going to treat you the way I want to because I am superior. But the other problem is we also internalize what Europeans say about us. So we start to self-denigrate. We believe what they say about us. We are not beautiful. We are not intelligent. We are not kind. We are not moral. And we believe them. There are many conservatives in the US now who say these things without knowing. They take the perspective of Europeans and instead of looking for solutions, they denigrate their own people. That they are the most violent, they are moral, their culture is vulgar. That's internalization of what Europeans say about Africans. There's also commodification of our appearance. It becomes something you can sell. For example, if you're light in skin, if you are quote unquote black, but you're light in skin, you have a higher chance of getting a job than someone who's dark. So the same thing in the court of law, you have a higher chance of getting a lesser sentence than someone who is darker. Police are more afraid of people who are dark in the skin. So it pays to have a lighter skin in the West, even today. There's also this question of Euro-solipsism, where Europeans treat the world as if they are the only people in existence. And you could see this in many things. For example, Europeans, they would tell Iran not to develop nuclear weapons, but they don't want to destroy this. It doesn't make any sense. The US would police the world about freedom, about democracy, about the rule of law. But when ICC came in, they did not want to be part of it. When the world came together and came up with the laws, United Nations laws, to protect children. Some of you may know United Nations Convention for the Rights of the Child. It was ratified by everyone except US and Somalia. Somalia ratified this in 2016. Only US is remaining. Of all the countries, imagine. Not North Korea, not Cuba, not Russia, United States. But US doesn't really care. Everyone else in the world doesn't really matter. The other ones will matter. So you can get some of this in one of the Hall's books. So I have the references at the end. And also there's a chapter I published a while ago in a book edited by Hall. You can also find some of the things I talk. Now, what is the effect of colorism on the youth? Denigration, praise. So people light in skin, praise, look, they're beautiful and things like that. They're kind. People who are darker, they get denigrated. They are the ones who are accused when something is stolen. The ones who are easily accused, they're violent, they're rude. And they're not seen as the epitome of beauty. In some cases, there's some cases where girls prefer boys who are light in skin. So there's this example which is revealing. So these are sisters. These are not just sisters, they're twins. Same mother, same father. The father is European, the mother is African, and they're twins. So this one came out looking like the father, this came out looking like the mother. So they have a fascinating story. So they used to be invited on talk shows. So they were invited and they were talking to some I think Australian newscasters. And there was one European Australian. And when she looked at them, she told this girl, you're lucky. Imagine they're two sisters, same mother, same father. But because this looks European and it looks like her, the newscaster, she thought she was lucky. So there was this internalized reality about things that she just said, these are sisters. But she preferred this one because she's light in the skin, and she said she was lucky. Now, if you look at these two, I don't know who can you say is more beautiful between the two. It's a question of taste. So because she's European, she thinks this is the one that's more beautiful. Someone who's African may say this is more beautiful. It's a question of preference. But because we live in a Eurocentric world, we cannot say she's more beautiful than this. Alienation, skin color default preference. So when you prefer a skin that is not like yours, you alienate yourself from your skin. So this is the default preference, not this one. So these people become alienated because this is what people prefer as a standard. It's normal. This is not normal. If you're beautiful, then your beauty is exceptional or it's exotic. Self-denigration. And I'll read a quote from a young South Sudanese who self-denigrated, didn't like his skin because the way he was treated. So psychological also. It gets into people's head. So superior and inferior sentiments, self-doubt. So you start to say, I'm not beautiful because I'm dark. Or a woman who's light in skin would assume she's beautiful because she's light, even if she's not beautiful. There's also the case of self-harm when you're made fun of. This is a South Sudanese girl in Edre. She passed away, I think, 2016. So she was made fun of in the school that she was dark. So she killed herself. So colorism can kill. It's not just something that people say. So this is a kid, she killed herself. And then we internalize what Europeans say. So there's a risk that if people continue to say she's more beautiful than her, there's a risk of her bleaching to look like her sister. So you see many people in India, in Africa, they bleach because they want to attain the ideals of beauty, which is European. So this is self-denigration. There's no way you can say you like your stuff, you like your skin, but you want to change it. Doesn't make any sense. So if you see any African who has bleached the skin, they don't like themselves. They don't like what they see in the mirror. That's why they bleach. I know there's some girls who say they don't care. They bleach. Yes, you think you don't care, but we know you feel less. So there's no way someone can admire you if you don't admire yourself. Commodification, capitalization of skin color. So as I said, the lighter you are, the better you are in terms of jobs, in terms of business, in terms of social relations, social capital. So also advantage in spousal choice. So if you're light in skin, so people want lighter spouses. So if you're light in skin, you can easily find a spouse who is well placed socially, with the highest social economic status, and then preferential treatment for jobs. Then there's this idea of conflating beauty with skin color, with lightness of the skin. For example, here, because she's light, then she's beautiful. So being dark in the skin means you're not beautiful. Because she's darker, she's not beautiful. She's not beautiful. She's beautiful because she's light. So being light skin, especially being European, means being beautiful. So beauty and lightness of skin are one and the same. So that means if you're dark in the skin, you cannot be beautiful. That would be a contradiction in the Eurocentric standard. So to see a beautiful African woman and call her beautiful, that would be a contradiction. So that's why sometimes Europeans get confused when they see a strikingly beautiful African woman or girl. They like her, but because she's dark, if in their heads, it's like, this is a contradiction. That's why they would tell some girl, you're beautiful for a black girl. And then you have equating of darkness of the skin with violence, ugliness, lack of intelligence. That's why it bothers me when I see African Studies Journal focusing on violence in Africa, on a lot of moral ugliness. They reinforce what Europeans used to say, and they still say today. So when you read scholarly works and all they focus on is what is bad about Africa, it becomes difficult for the rest of the world to know something positive about lack of intelligence. So many people, when they see people like us, they don't always see intelligence, unless if you try to prove it, they get surprised, or they may admit. But in most cases, when they see you, the first thing that comes to mind is not intelligence, it's lack of intelligence, fear. So this is the South Sudanese young man. Yuban Van Ngo is a professor of social work at the University of Calgary. So he did this study, I think around 2013 or so. So this is a South Sudanese young man, and this is what he said about himself. I was looking at the mirror. I just wanted to feel like spitting at myself, spit on my skin or something. I just hated it, disliked it. I just felt like people look at me and call me the N-word. That's why I hated myself. Even if I was a little bit lighter than this, you see, gesturing vertical hierarchy. There's black, and then there's light, and then there is a little bit black, and then there is mulatto, and then all the way down here is where tar is, and I'm like there, pointing to the bottom. That's what I feel like. These kinds of light-skinned guys, they get away with everything. Me, I'm black. So I said somewhere regarding this young man isn't looking at himself through his own eyes. He's looking at himself through European eyes, through what people say. So what he sees when he looks at the mirror is not himself, it's what he's been told he is. That's what Eurocentrism does to people. And to feel good about himself, this young man joined gangs. That's where he finds power, validation. So one of the things Yuval Noah did was, why do young people get involved in gangs? There was another quotation in the study where a Japanese young man said he wasn't going to marry Japanese because Japanese are not beautiful. He was going to marry a white woman, a European woman, so that the kids come out beautiful. It's what society does to young people. Now, how do we shift the perspective from Eurocentrism, which centers European, to a more inclusive world? So this is what Afrocentric prism says. So Asante, who is well known as the father of Afrocentricity, he makes a distinction between Afrocentrism and Afrocentricity. He says Afrocentricity is a philosophical theory and paradigm. Afrocentrism also contains religious dimension. So Asante doesn't believe Afrocentricity has any religious dimension. And for those of you who know, a theory is a set of assumptions or principles that are used to explain a given social phenomena. In some cases, generalized, but I don't want to use the word generalized, but we use it to make sense of a certain phenomena. We can talk about the Marxist theory, we can talk about feminist theory or post-colonial theory. There are a set of assumptions that are made by a certain theory, and these assumptions are used as lens to look at certain social phenomena, physical phenomena, or any phenomena. So this is what Asante said. So that's the distinction. So Asante uses Afrocentricity, not Afrocentrism. But for my case, I use them as one and the same because I don't look at the religious dimension, but I look at the fact that both look at the world from an Afrocentric perspective, African perspective. This is what Asante said. So Afrocentrism is a frame of reference wherein phenomena are viewed from the perspective of the African person. It centers on placing people of African origin in control of their lives and attitudes about the world. That's Asante. This is Mazama. She's also another prominent Afrocentric scholar. So in the process, Afrocentrism also means viewing the European voice as just one among many, not necessarily the wisest one. I'll show you a graphic now, but in the previous one I showed you, the European voice was the one that was in the center. It was copied by the other ones. The other ones learned from the European. But Mazama is saying European voice is not dismissed, but it's just one among many. So that's, and I'll show you, for us Afrocentrists, they don't think the world should be Afrocentric. They say Afrocentrism or African-centered viewpoint is just one among. So they move toward polycentric world as opposed to Afrocentric world or Eurocentric world. So this is also what Mazama said about how we internalize European ways of looking at things and we think they are natural. So Afrocentricity contends that our main problem as African people is our usually unconscious adoption of the Western worldview and perspective and the attendant conceptual frameworks. Sometimes we look at things we learn in a school and we think they are somehow natural and they're applicable universally. That universality is a European perspective. Some cases. The list of those ideas and theories that have invaded our lives as normal, natural, or even worse, ideal is infinite. So there are very many of this that we've internalized. So that's Mazama. Now, this is what Afrocentrists say. We move from this European-centered world to a polycentric world. So in this case, the rest learn from Europe. Europe doesn't learn anything from them. European doesn't learn anything from them. Morality, beauty, intelligence, everything is copied from Europeans. So this is a Eurocentric world which we have. Afrocentrics would say we need a more polycentric world where the rest of the people learn from one another. So this role should be two-way. I should have corrected this two ways. Europeans learn from Africans, Africans learn from European, Asians learn from Europeans, Europeans learn from Asian, all the way. Now, some people may accuse me of what they call cultural relativism, and they dismiss it because they think Europeans have attained higher level of social development and cultural development. So all cultures are not the same. That's fine. That is fine. On face value, that's fine. But that doesn't mean they cannot learn anything from others. That doesn't mean they have to center themselves. There are so many things they can still learn from others. So the problem is to do this, to say that Europeans cannot learn. So what this one says, it doesn't say that Europeans cannot be seen as having developed a higher level social organization. You can still make that argument. I'm not saying that that's what has happened, but you can make that argument and still maintain this. The best thing about this is you cannot impose your ideas on the rest. They can learn from you if they want to learn from you. The problem with Eurocentrism is it forces the rest, even sometimes by violence, to adopt some of the ideals, even the worst one. What we don't talk about most of the time is what the Europeans have learned from Africans, for example. Europeans, they learn from Africans that it's okay to live together with people who don't look like you. This is something Europeans learned from Africans when they were colonizing, they were enslaving them. Europeans didn't understand the idea that someone who looks darker can also be your equal. They did not develop this. They learned it from Africans. We don't talk about this, but these are things we have to bring up in a scholarship. They learned a lot from Africans. They did not democratize Africans. They did not take any democracy through colonialism because the colonial regime was not democratic. It was authoritarian. So starting from the scramble for Africa, Europe wasn't democratic. It continued to improve itself. It was civilizing itself, improving itself, democratizing itself. So when they went to Africa, they were not civilized people per se. They had developed, they modernized some things, but they were learning. They were making so many things up as they went. So historical examples. So when we talk about Afrocentricity, we also need to show specific examples from history. So this is what Norwood is saying, that Africans have not always preferred light skin. That's a given. She also gives the example of in the Congo. If the kid was born with lighter skin, they would be put outside in the sun so that they can darken. So because darkness of the skin was the standard, the more beautiful. There's an example that was given by Stevens when she was in Sudan. In her book, I think My 5 Years in Sudan or something like that. I have the book. It's also free online in PDF form. So there's a story the young people told her about how they prefer their own skin. It's a book and Garang. So a book had twins. One was beautiful, skin was black and soft and glossy. There was another one who was red in the skin, as raw or as as raw as meat, or as the English. So one of the things Abundi did, she hid the dark one, the black one, and then gave the red one to Garangdi, because this was the most beautiful one. There's a lot you can read from the book, but the point here is she preferred the darker skin one, because that is what was standard for the Jane people. There's another one from the Rake people, where Tetherington was also in Sudan at the turn of the century, the 20th century. So the Rake was making this is the Rake Dinka, or Jeng of Rake. So they were making fun of Europeans. So to the Rake Dinka, to the Rake, the look of a European, which we call Turuk, Turks, is disgusting and frightens children. His skin is the color of a man inflicted with leukoderma or leprosy, as has a fierce-looking vulture's beak of a nose and a light-colored cat's eyes. He covers his shameful body with clothes, and rumor says it is scarcely less hairy than nyam-nyams or baboons. So this is an African looking at European. So he thought the appearance of Africans was normal, but the appearance of Europeans was abnormal. There's another one from David Livingstone. He was a missionary in Central Africa, Southern Africa. He said kids used to run away from him when they saw him. And they would also use him to scare kids away. He also writes in the book that when they look at his hair, they said his hair looks like the mane of the lion. So that is looking at things from your perspective. I say these things not to be used against other people. It's to tell kids, when people valorize their own beauty, you shouldn't feel bad about yourself, because that's what they see as normal. Like when Europeans say Marilyn Monroe is the most beautiful, because that's what they see in the mirror. That's what looks like them. You don't expect them to look at themselves in the mirror and then valorize something else that doesn't look like them. No. So how about the policies we can use to help young people? So dark skin makes students stand out to authorities like the teachers, the police, and judges. So it's very easy to pick on them. And that makes them very highly self-conscious. And when they're self-conscious, they easily get triggered. And that is easily rationalized as being rude, and they easily get in trouble. But as adults, we have to remember this. We are the ones to guide them, not expect them to act like adults. We call this adultification. So helping Kada youth understand that people tend to prefer the appearance that is like that. That's what I said. So if young people know, if you see in the news, on TV, in magazines that the people they call beautiful do not look like you, it's because the majority of the people who edit this, who make these things, look like the people they say are the most beautiful. So kids need to understand this, and we need to inculcate in their minds over and over again. And we are the ones to do it, not Europeans, not someone else. So people look at others from their vantage point. So like the Reg Dinka looking at Europeans from their vantage. So they also need to understand that beauty has not always been Eurocentric. So this is something that has risen. Today, the beauty standard is Eurocentric, but it has not always been like that before colonialism. And we can always show them historical examples that are actually written by Europeans, not Africans. So the ones I was reading to you were written by Europeans, not Africans. So also colorism, there's an element of self-elevation. So when Blumenberg talked about the Caucasian and the Georgian girl, he was self-elevating. He was trying to feel good about themselves. The Europeans are human beings. They have to exalt themselves. They have to valorize themselves. They have to say they are more beautiful. That's normal for human beings. So it's a perspective. It's a preference. We can't, in some cases, we don't have to fault Europeans because they have to say that whether we like it or not. Even when they pretend, they can become condescending, but deep down, they will say that. Also, no one is going to protect your emotional well-being. Now, Europeans do not have some sort of a natural control or more powerful emotional cover. No, they don't. Insult Trump and he's going to insult you back. Insult Elon Musk and he's going to lose his mind, because emotions are not things we can control. No one, you can have all the power, economic power, social power, but still when it comes to emotions, no social group has emotional control. Individuals, yes, maybe individuals, but not as a group. So no one can come and protect your emotions. You are the ones to do it. You do it on your own over time. So there was an example of a young man in the book written by Jennifer Kelly in 1998. So she studied for a doctoral PhD. So she interviewed African Canadian youth in Edmonton School in 1996, 95, I think. And there was a young man who used to read about African history. And at the time, there was nothing taught about African history or Black history. So she went to school and she knew things his social study teacher didn't know. He was so proud of himself. There was another girl who did the same thing. She was so proud of herself. So he would go to school and, did you know this? Did you know this about Steve Biko or Malcolm X and this? A kid like that cannot easily be broken down emotionally. One of the kids knew what the social studies teacher didn't know, that the first woman to be a newspaper publisher, an editor in Canada, first one, was an African Canadian woman who came from the US and was in southern Ontario. The teacher didn't know that, and this kid knew it. So history can help kids become, emotionally stronger. So these things can also complement structural changes, because as much as we tell kids develop your own emotional strength, we also need structural changes in terms of policies in schools, with the police, and in government. So we also need Afrocentric scholarship to sort of counteract. So this should be counteract, not counteract white supremacy. Because as you know, Afrocentrism doesn't say it's the African perspective that is the best and the only one. No, it is just one of the rest. It doesn't dismiss European perspective. It doesn't say it's less than. It doesn't even say it doesn't have more ideas than the Afrocentric perspective. It just say it's one. Africans can learn from that. But Eurocentrism valorized one. For example, that Europeans are superior and things like that. This is what Afrocentrism dismisses. So adapting curricula that encourage polycentrism, so that you ensure that people who live in a certain demographic are shown, they see themselves in curriculum, they see themselves in film, they see themselves in those elements in society. Now, this is not to say that founding people should not be given their due. For example, in Canada, the French and the English were the founding people, and then indigenous people. They should always be given those places. Of course, for example, if you look at the laws, you look at the cities, the streets, they're all named after them. No one is going to remove them. Few of them, yes, are being questioned because of the involvement with racism, but we need to be mindful. I don't agree with the idea of changing names. No, I don't. But teaching history so that kids, for example, African kids know the African Canadians who fought during World War I, World War II, or things like that. So letting kids know that some of the perspectives they have were influenced by history, by culture, by the society. They are not natural. They should always question some of the things they are told. Thank you. So the next video will be on Sudanization between 1953 and 1956. And then I want to extend it to 1963 when the Anyanya War began. Thank you.